Hello everyone and welcome to video 2 of the module 2, and we're going to talk today about altars and shrines. So let's start off by talking about what is an altar, what is a shrine. So the American Dictionary, it says that an altar is a type of table used in religious ceremonies. And then shrines are similar to an altar, but it's a place specifically dedicated to gods and spirits. So normally, the shrine will have idols of gods and spirits on them, whereas an altar may just be a table where you put out your tools. Okay. Now, there isn't actually that much evidence for home-based shrines in heathen cultures, but there are some things we can learn about that are suggestive that there probably was home-based shrines. Okay. So first we've got Eyrbyggja Saga, which mentions an altar table in a temple. So clearly, when they have a temple, they do have altars. So they're aware of that concept. Okay. Now you've got Alpha Blot, which is the blot to the elves, or the sacrifice to the elves. That was done in the home. Okay. You also have various other accounts of rituals being done in the home. You've got Thorvald's Fifthforler, which records a woman sacrificing in her home. And there's also an account of a farmer leading a rite for his entire household. And Sather divinatory ceremonies were also usually done in the home. So all these things suggest that there probably was something going on in the home, and because there was, the likelihood is that there was some sort of altar or shrine there. Now, after Iceland converted, heathens were still allowed to practice heathenry at home in secret. In Anglo-Saxon England, we often see place names with a meaning of sanctuary or shrine of X family name, which again suggests private worship places. And there are quite a few instances of farmsteads being called hof or temple. So what we can see here is that there are lots of examples of home worship. Okay, so even if there wasn't evidence of altars and shrines in the home, there is evidence that the home was used as a place of worship. H.R. Ellis Davison, in Myths and Symbols in Pagan Europe, writes, individuals in Scandinavia evidently set up small shrines for their own use, as Thorolf of Helgafell is said to have erected a temple for Thor near his own house in Iceland, where the sacred ring of the god and a bowl used for sacrifices were kept. However, such temples appear to correspond to these small shrines of Celtic areas rather than the large temple buildings of the Romans. So they're small home-based shrines, probably. The temples that they set up, the small temples, were probably very similar. Okay, so let's look at the ancient worship sites. What evidence do we have? If we go back to the early period, and we look at the earliest source texts, the earliest archaeology, that sort of stuff, we find that it's primarily outside, okay? It's in sacred groves, water sources, rivers, lakes, bogs, shafts, that sort of thing, okay? Tacitus, he tells us, their holy places are woods and groves, and they apply the name of deities to that hidden presence which is seen only by the eye of reverence, okay? So they're actually, he's suggesting here that they didn't even have idols. It was just a sacred, numinous presence in special places. Now, they also have other examples. There's sacred trees. There's burial mounds. These are places that we know worship was carried out as well. Earlier Anglo-Saxon kings like Edgar, when they become Christians, they banned things like well worshipping and the worship at trees and stones. The 7th century Theodore of York, he calls for punishment for those who made offerings at trees or at wells or at stones or at enclosures. So again, outdoor worship. The Gutelag Law Code, it mentions worship at woods, mounds, sanctuaries and enclosures. And it's important to note here that when we're talking about enclosures, we're not talking about a building. We're talking about a fenced off area, maybe with rope, maybe with a hedge, maybe with wood. That's what we mean by an enclosure here. Turville Petra, he says, the place names of Scandinavia provide rich evidence of sanctuaries and holy places. They were often out of doors, and the words Vanger, Vin, Acker, which means meadow or cornfield, were applied to them, as well as Huger, which means mound. Okay. Turville Petra also says, it is noteworthy that words used in the Germanic languages for places of worship or temple often have the meaning of grove as well. So a grove is a sacred group of trees. Basically, it's a group of trees and there's an opening in the middle, and that is the grove. Okay. A ve is a Norse word, and it means sacred space. And it's probably something that's surrounded by a fence or a hedge, because there's this word ve bond, and these are ropes that are used to surround a legal site. So a ve is a sacred space marked off with these ve bonds, these ropes. Okay. There's the word horga, which means a holy pile of stones, or an altar or a temple, potentially. It originally meant a holy place. Basically, it's a pile of rocks used as an outdoor altar. So you can see that in the picture there. And later it is used to mean a roofed temple as well. But archaeology suggests that these were just small buildings, okay? Then in the Poetic Edda, in Hinlu Joth 10, it says, for me a shrine of stones he made. And this is referring basically to a pile of stones like this. There's the Anglo-Saxon word harg, which means holy grove, temple, idol, or a sanctuary in an elevated position. So often these are on hilltops. And you can see in the picture there a hill in Yorkshire, in England, where Odin was worshipped by the Vikings. And there's loads of these all over Northern Europe. So the Horga or the Horg is often also found in place names. So it becomes the word Harrow. So if you get any place names that have the word Harrow in it, you know that was an ancient site of worship for the Anglo-Saxons or the heathens. The Anglo-Saxons also have this word Wea, which means idol or shrine. And in modern Anglo-Saxon heathenry, that's what we call our altars, or sometimes the god statues that sit on them. And I mentioned in the module 1, the book by Wagner. He's written a couple of other ones as well. And he writes in one of them, they built low heaps of stones, usually cracked by fires and mixed with bone fragments and charcoal to mark places of sacrifice, e.g. as found at Lidra in Denmark, Opakra in Sweden, Ranheim in Norway. So archaeology has found a lot of these sites where there is these piles of stones which have got bone fragments and fires, evidence of fire and charcoal and stuff. Clearly, it's a sacred worship place. Okay, so when we're going back really early, what we're finding is a lot of outdoor worship, hilltops, stones and stone piles, lakes, rivers, groves of trees, burial mounds, etc. So basically, they're mainly outdoor shrines, but the hearth was important in the household as well. There's no sort of standard altar setup that anyone can find. It probably met local needs, so it was localized to the individual family or the individual community and how they set this thing up. There are some ideas that we can pull from different places to set up what our standard altar would be, and we'll explore that in a minute. But there is no actual definite guaranteed standard across all altars that we find. The place name evidence, as I said, suggests a lot of hills were often used for pagan worship as well. So you've got the words like God's Hill or Harrow Hill. Okay. Now, Bede, he's an English monk. When he writes about the English heathens, he quotes Pope Gregory. Okay, now Pope Gregory was trying to convert the English heathens to Christianity. And so he writes this letter to explain how the best way to do that. And he says, since they have a custom of sacrificing many oxen to devils, let some other solemnity be substituted in its place, such as a day of dedication or the festivals of the holy martyrs, whose relics are enshrined there. On such occasions, they might well construct shelters of boughs for themselves around the churches that were once temples, and celebrate the solemnity with devout feasting. They are no longer to sacrifice beasts to the devil, but they may kill them for food to the praise of God and give thanks to the giver of all goods, of all gifts for his bounty. So the Pope is saying here then that the way to convert the English is let them continue their practices and sites, but use them for Christian purposes. So it's saying they're not allowed to sacrifice animals anymore, but they can kill animals and give thanks to God for it. They can, this particular days need to be changed into Christian holy days, but it's still the same date, basically. And then he says this interesting thing about shelters of boughs around the churches that were once temples. So firstly, he's saying that there were once temples and the churches, basically temples have been converted into churches. He's saying there was feasting, but they also were allowed to construct these shelters of boughs. Okay, so this goes back almost to that sort of tent-like structure that we saw a bit earlier on. Okay, and which we're going to see in a minute as well, or sort of a temporary shelter. So let's go to this sort of later on period then. So as we progress into the Viking Age and stuff, you get a lot more evidence of indoor worship. And this has probably changed due to Roman and Christian influence and possibly the rise of more powerful chieftains who can afford to have these big halls and things. Obviously, Romans and Christians, they had particularly big temples, they had big churches and things like that. So that's probably influenced the Germanic peoples to want to have the same sort of thing. But there is still some outdoors worship going on. You've got, particularly in Iceland, you've got an Icelandic settler who brought a sacrifice to a grove. You've got the Icelanders establishing a grove of Thor. You've got them bringing sacrifices to rocks. So clearly the outdoor worship is continuing, but it's less now than it was. In more established communities, definitely, there's temples and halls being built. We can see an example of this in Uppsala, in Sweden, where Adam of Bremen mentions this big temple complex, and he mentions that there's the god statues of Thor and Woden and Frey there. In England, we've got Yeavering Bell in Northumberland, where again, archaeologists think that there was a temple there. It was a big royal complex, and as part of that, there's a building that looks like it was probably a temple because it has places for god posts. It doesn't have evidence of human habitation. It just has these pits for animals that are sacrificed to go into. So it seems to be that was a temple building. And the temples that we here talked about or see, they have sacred groves and trees and wells nearby, and they often have an enclosure around them, like a fenced area. It's particularly true of Uppsala. Adam of Bremen mentions about a sacred tree and a sacred well there. Now you've got the Old English word "hel," which means temple. You've also got rich people, which often built temples for themselves. You've got the word Kussenwale, which means Kusa's temple, and Pepperharrow, which means Piper's temple. You've got the word Hof, which was referred to farms, but also referring to temple. So you've got lots of examples of the use of temples, basically. Hof itself actually was probably not applied to temples until the late period of heathenry. It's often used in the sagas, but rarely mentioned in the Eddas or poetry. And if we want to come back earlier, though, Bede mentions that there were heathen temples in England that were converted into churches. So this is going to be happening in the 600s. So there's probably heathen temples in England by the 600s. He also mentioned them being surrounded by a fence or a hedge, that idea of that enclosure again. Okay. And he mentions one in Northumbria that had altars dedicated to idols, but it was destroyed by Christians in 627 AD. So you can see actually some of these temples are quite early. And Turville Petra says, in later times, the Horga was a small temple or shrine, perhaps used chiefly for private or family worship. So what there probably was is household worship and outdoor worship, and then gradually you get these small temples, and then gradually they can become bigger temples and halls, okay, over time. Gail Owen mentions a study of pagan worship in Denmark by Olaf Olsen and says, there were evidently two kinds of worshipping place. One, an ordinary building in a farm or home, used on special occasions for religious feasts. The other, away from the dwelling, need be no more than the idols or sacred features themselves, which might in the course of time come to be protected by a tent or other temporary cover. It is this latter type of temple that developed from the sacred grove and is perpetuated in the place names. So what we're seeing here basically is there's a small building maybe in the home or the farm used for worship, and then more out in nature there's maybe some idol set up just in a sacred grove or something, and that's it. And then over time people decide to add a tent or other temporary cover for these idols, and then gradually that becomes the place names, and maybe bigger temples will develop out, things like that. Now, the hall becomes a really important part of heathenry, by the Viking Age, definitely. It's mentioned in many texts. Beowulf, the sagas, archaeologists have found lots of examples of halls. It basically was the center of the community. It's where a lot of the stories take place. It is multifunctional. Okay, so it's not just a community center. It does have that secular thing. It does have a place where you can come and meet and chat and drink and all that sort of stuff. But it also has cultic uses. It has a religious and ceremonial use. Okay, and this is because the chieftain is not just the leader, the political leader of the tribe or the community. He's also the gothi, the priest, basically the religious leader, and it's him that is responsible to the gods for the success of the community. It's him that's responsible for making the sacrifices to the gods. It's him that's the representative, basically, of the community to the gods. Okay, so and he maintains this religious role as well as the secular role. Now, in the center of that building is the hearth, and we're going to come back to the importance of the hearth and the fire a bit later. So again, in the book, The Signals of Belief in Early England, they're quoting Olsen here again, and he says, the ideological character of the hall itself is closely connected with its possible function as the theatre for religious ceremonies. After Olsen, 1966, had spent much time analysing texts like the Landnámabók, he concluded that there was no evidence to suggest that the early medieval pagan peoples used separate temple buildings. It was proposed that the Hof was a farm where cult meetings were held for more people than those living there, i.e., the word Hof, in fact, just denoted a hall. So he's saying basically that there isn't these separate temple buildings, but basically the hall itself is what's being used for the religious cult meetings, religious practices. Okay. Whether I mean, this was 1966, so that's quite a long time ago. Recent archaeological evidence may suggest otherwise, but on the whole, he's probably right with that. Okay. Okay, so let's now talk about central pillars. So we've talked about the hall. Now we're going to talk about the pillar. So pillars seem to have been a key feature at sacred sites, and possibly they had the god faces carved on them. You can see down the bottom right there a picture of a pillar with god faces on them. And perhaps it represented a cosmic axis mundi around which the cosmos or the community itself was organized. Okay. Or maybe it was about holding up the sky. Or maybe it was about connecting the worlds. I mean, there's lots of different theories. You need to take the one that best, or the ones that best fit you and your ideas. Okay. Now, there's also the sacred trees, which are like pillars. So you've got for instance, Yggdrasil, the world tree. At Uppsala Temple, as I mentioned, there was this sacred tree there where sacrifices were hanged. You have Donar's oak. Donar is Thor, basically. So it's Thor's oak. which was cut down by Christian priests because it was seen as a sacred object. You have the tundra, which is a guardian tree at the center of a Scandinavian courtyard. Often they'd have this special sacred tree with a spirit in it, and they'd have the farm built around it. You have the Lerarther, which is next to Valhall. So again, you've got your hall next to a tree. And you've got Mimimerther, which is Mimir's tree. Okay, so again, you've got Mimir's well with a tree next to it. The Anglo-Saxons, they had place names including Staple, which mean, for instance, Thurstaple, which means Thor's column, or Barstaple, which means the bearded one's pole. And the bearded one here again is referring to Thor. So you're having Thor is quite tightly knit up with this idea of this this pole, this central pillar. Aldhelm, he's an Anglo-Saxon. He writes in 680 AD of heathen pillars with images of serpents and stags were being pulled down. You've got the Saxon Irminsul, which means great pillar, which was at Eresburg. And then Charlemagne comes later and destroys that, again, because he's trying to convert them to Christianity. So it shows, again, this pillar is a really important central part of their religious practice. In the 9th century, you've got Rudolf of Fulda, who says that the Irminsul was a universal column as if it were sustaining everything. So is it holding up the sky or holding up the universe? In Norway, it's forbidden to keep or it was in the law, forbidden to keep a stick in the house and venerate it. So this suggests that these pillars are being brought home into the household and venerated, or at least in a smaller form. In the temples, you can see this. So there's a sacred pillar, Heathenry, which was set up on a barrow mound, and around which the whole community basically was organized. And there's also various other post holes in the pagan temple at Heathenry, which locally contained god poles or representations of the world tree. You've got this word Onvegissular, which means spirit way pillars. And this is often used as part of land taking rites, or even had god faces carved into them, for instance, in the saga of the Airy people. Or it may have god nails hammered into them, which you can use then to strike and get fire. Some more evidence. You've got Widukind. He says that the Saxons raised columns to the god Mars, which is Tu or Tyr. You've got Anglo-Saxons who are holding assemblies, so important community events, at ash trees. So ash trees are an important central place in the community for important meetings. You've got these tricorn stones in Sweden, which basically is stones set out in like 3 lines as a triangle. And in the center, you've got either a tree or a wood pillar or a tall stone. And it's almost like the world tree coming out with then 3 roots of stones, which is really interesting. You've got Jamtland, where there's a church that's been built over this great birch tree. And around it had been these remnants of sacrifices. So they found these sacrifice remnants there, suggesting that tree and sacrifice were going together. In the lore, you've got Thor at one point is called the Himmelsjolly, the pillar of heaven. So again, a link with Thor here. You've got many Christian texts and laws which are condemning heathens because they're worshipping at trees. And you've even got Anglo-Saxon laws which forbade setting up a frithyard, which is like a sanctuary, a land area that's surrounded by a fence or a hedge in which peace must be observed. Okay, and frith means peace, basically. So it forbids setting up a frithyard on anyone's land around a stone or a tree or a spring. Okay, so again, we've got this sacred place, and in the center we've got maybe a stone or a tree there, which could be a central pillar. The Norse also has this concept of a Stafgarthur, a sacred area specifically around a post. You've got trees and wells frequently described together in Christian accounts of pagan worship in Northern Europe. So not just heathens, but other pagan groups as well. Trees and wells seem to go together quite a lot. Okay, so remember that because that's going to be quite important in our cosmology building here. In the Norwegian farms, as we often said, they have a single guardian tree, a tundra or courtyard tree, where the farm buildings are built around. There's also the barnstalker tree, which is a tree around which a house is built. So it's part of the actual house itself. And it had to be offered drink in ceremonies related to birth, death, the round of the year. And it symbolized the luck and continuity of the family living within the house, according to Stephen Pollington. And the people's fate was bound up with its fate. So we can see here that pillars and trees seem to be an essential part of worship, okay? Which makes sense if your worship is starting off from outdoors. Okay, so let's have a look at fire. So I would say that fire is the single most important element to have in your rituals on your altar, okay? It represents the fire of the hearth. It is the center of the home, or in the community setting, the center of the community, okay? And ultimately, it's all about this idea of hospitality, which we keep coming back to, okay? Hospitality towards the guests, the gods, the spirits, okay? There's a thing in Heathenry that says, blessed be the givers, a guest has come in. Fire is needful for someone who's come in. So it's telling us that if you're going to be hospitable to someone, if you're going to welcome the guests, the gods, the spirits and stuff, fire is an important part of that. Very early on in the Heathenry, we're getting this, okay? So you must have some example of fire on your altar and in every ritual you do. Fire is also important in the sacred meals, okay? It cooks the sacred meal, it transforms the sacred meal. It's important for that. And it transforms the food into something that the gods can consume, the energy into something the gods can consume. There's also the outdoor offerings, which are burned in fire. So if you set up a bonfire or you have some sort of outdoor altar with fire on, you can put offerings into that and it will burn it up and transform it. In Eyrbyggja's saga, there's these god nails, so like nails that are put into the head of the god posts, and they could potentially be used to strike, and then you get fire from them. So potentially, that's a way of how they could get sacred fire. In Hakon the Good saga in Heimskringla, it talks about this ritual basically, and it says that there's a fire in the middle of this temple, or this hall basically on the floor, and it's used to cook of the ritual feast that they're feasting. So fire is important here for actually cooking up the ritual meat, the ritual feast, okay? In a late saga, Kjalnesinga saga, it talks about a fire on an altar in the temple. It says, this was the place for the fire, which was never allowed to go out. They called this the sacred fire. Now, this is something we find across the Indo-European world. So we have sacred fires that aren't allowed to go out in Greece and Rome. Also, there's this one in Prussia as well, which is in the Slavic areas. And they have a sacred grove for the thunder god, Kronos, where there is a fire that was never allowed to go out. Okay. So we're seeing this in quite a few different places. The idea of this perpetual fire that's not allowed to go out because it's sacred, basically. Later in the saga, a priest also carries fire around the temple, which seems to be some sort of like purification. And often fire is also carried around land, and that's about, well, it can be purification, but it can also just be land taking, okay? So it could be just taking the land or claiming the land. There's a folklore practice in Scandinavia called the Fire Day ritual, which aims to bless the hearth. So usually it's on the 7th of January or maybe on Candlemas, which is like the 2nd of February. There's something called the Elbjorg toast, okay? And people gather, they kneel before the fire, they toast the fire, they eat some cake and offer the rest of them beer and cake to the fire. And then they also pray to Woden or Odin to empower but contain the fire, that one's warmth will never die out. Okay, so it's a sort of a blessing of the fire ritual. It's something we could do as heathens nowadays as well. Okay, horns were often carried around fires as part of the toasting rituals. Okay, you can see that in the Hakon the Good saga, they they circumambulate basically the horn around the fire. In the Jarl saga, it mentions heathens sacralizing fire, so making it sacred. Fire is also one of the two elements which are the building blocks of creation, as we saw in the cosmology video. So it's important to have these building blocks of creation on your altar. Okay. Now, Claude Locuto, he's written some excellent books on paganism in Europe, and particularly talks about house spirits in one of his books. And he mentions how the house spirit is often associated with the fire and the hearth, but also the oven. So often in, say, Germany, they would see the house spirit as something that lives behind the oven. And maybe we could take this into our modern day by seeing a house spirit either, again, as living in the oven or behind it, or the boiler, and maybe have a small altar there for the house spirit. Other Indo-European cultures also have a god or goddess of the fire. So you've got Agni is the Hindu god or Vedic god of the fire, who takes the sacrifices from the fire up to the gods. You've got Vesta in Rome, you've got Hestia in Greece, you've got Brigid in the Celtic countries. So lots of these Indo-European cultures have a god or goddess of fire. We don't seem to have one necessarily in heathenry, or it's not very clear. Some people think Loki, some people think Thor, and so on have associations with fire, but there's not a specific fire god or goddess. So it's hard to know on that. Possibly Aostra is also a potential one as well. The 18th and 19th century Scandinavia, they had examples of folklore of offerings being given to fire and spirits being believed to live in the fireplace. So like I said, with the house spirits in Claude Locuto's book. Now there's a particular type of fire called the need fire. And this is fire that's kindled by friction. So often it involves you creating like a bow with some string, and you hold the wood with a tip into another piece of wood, and you're rolling it back and forth, and it creates friction, and it creates some sparks and fire. Okay, and this is called the need fire, and this is often used in trolldom nowadays, and in the past, but it goes back a long way. So you've got it being condemned by the Frankish ruler Carloman in 742 CE. He says, those sacrilegious fires, which they call need fire. And you've got the Indiculus Superstitionum et Paganorum, which is based in Germany. It was condemning pagan practices in Germany, and it bans pagan practices, including about fire rubbed from wood. That is nodfir. Okay, so the need fire again. Fire can also be struck from flint and steel, and it was used to ward off evil spirits, according to Saxo, which is it's interesting because obviously steel contains iron, and iron is particularly important later as a protection against evil spirits. You've also got the nail in the god's head that I mentioned, which they do the flint against to create fire. You have accounts of people bringing embers from communal fires to light their own house fire in the spring. So there'd be like maybe a communal bonfire, which contains the blessings of the community, and everyone would gather the embers from that and take that to their home and light their own house fire from that, bringing sort of the blessings of the community into their own home for the year. You've got fire for purification, for healing, for blessing, for driving away bad spirits. Often incense and smoke is used to drive away bad spirits. It can also be used to encourage spirits as well. A nice smelling incense is something that will encourage spirits, especially the good spirits. Ashes from fire are often poured on fields to bless them. In the Celtic cultures, they pushed cattle at Beltane, so May Day sort of time. They pushed cattle between two fires for purification, to keep them sort of safe and pure from any spirits for the coming months. You have bonfires being held in folk tradition on really important sacred days: Easter, May Day, Midsummer, Halloween, which shows that bonfires are considered a sacred thing because they're associated with these sacred days. You can have omens taken from fire. Now, those are sort of the reasons why fire is so important, and all the different examples we can see in the lore about how we can use fire, why fire is so important. But essentially, it comes back to this. It's about hospitality. It's about you providing warmth and offerings to the spirits. Now, if you can't have a real candle or fire, it's fine to use a battery-operated one. I mean, the ideal is always the real thing, but if you can't, it still is going to provide heat and energy to the spirits using a battery, okay? If you've got an outdoor altar, maybe you could build a fire next to your pile of rocks, or you can even include it within the pile of rocks, sort of the center point, and then the rocks are built around it. So there's different ways of bringing it, or you can use a fire pit or something like that. The important thing, though, obviously remember, is fire safety. Don't leave candles burning unattended. Don't leave fire unattended. Make sure you've got water and things to put things out available. Just be safe, okay? But fire is really important to have on your altar. Okay, so that's sort of the theoretical side of things. I'm going to stop this video here, and then we're going to start the next video talking specifically about the practicalities of setting up your shrine.